The oldest record in the Concord archive was a thin slab of dark crystal etched in a hand no modern species could identify, and for thousands of cycles it sat ignored because its message was too simple to be interesting. A single translated line repeated in every known proto-language saying, "Do not provoke humans." A warning without context tends to rot in bureaucratic silence. And so when the Keeler Expansion Authority first encountered humanity on the edge of a yellow star system, they saw nothing that matched the fear implied by that ancient phrase. They saw a species still bound to planets, still arguing among itself, still relying on chemical propulsion for most of its civilian craft, and the reports filed by Surveyor Halrex reflected that assumption with clean efficiency as he described humans as emotionally reactive but technologically average, culturally fragmented, and strategically insignificant. And those words moved up the chain until they reached the desks of admirals and ministers who already believed the galaxy belonged to those who took it, not those who hesitated. And so the Concord Council convened not to debate the warning but to formally archive it as a mythic relic, a cultural curiosity from a forgotten age when the galaxy was younger and fear was easy to carve into stone than fact. And in that same cycle on Earth, a woman named Elena Park stood in a quiet observation room above the Pacific, watching a network of lights ripple across a curved screen. As deep space sensors picked up the first unambiguous signature of a foreign fleet decelerating just beyond the heliopause, she had waited 20 years for that moment and felt no triumph when it arrived, only a tightening in her chest as she said to the officers beside her that the visitors were early and not bothering to hide, which meant they were either careless or confident, and both options were bad. While light years away, the Keeler flagship entered the system in perfect formation. Its Commander Vial Turin observing the small blue planet with a mix of mild interest and professional boredom as he remarked that the species had not yet deployed a formal greeting array and that their orbital defenses were primitive, suggesting a short demonstration would be sufficient to establish dominance. And when his tactical officer hesitated and mentioned the archived warning, Vial dismissed it with a wave of his hand and said that every empire leaves behind ghost stories to protect its pride, and that no species capable of true power would hide it behind a single sentence. And so the fleet advanced inward, crossing lines that humanity had never marked on any chart but had quietly agreed upon in rooms that did not exist on public maps. And as the first Keeler ships passed Mars, Elena received confirmation from an automated system that had never before been activated. A simple green indicator labeled Contingency Echo that told her the visitors had failed the first test, the one that required nothing more than restraint, and she authorized a message to be sent not to the fleet but to an address buried in a classified network older than most nations, a place where retired admirals, civilian engineers, and cultural historians still met under the shared understanding that humanity survived not because it was strongest but because it prepared for the day it would need to be. And that same day on the Keeler Bridge, a communication finally arrived from Earth, translated cleanly and broadcast across all channels saying, "Welcome to the Sol System. Please state your intent." And Vial smiled at the politeness and replied that his authority claimed the system for resource evaluation and that compliance would ensure minimal disruption, and the delay before the human response irritated him because it suggested indecision. But when it came, it was only a single sentence saying this system is not available for evaluation. Please withdraw. And Vial laughed softly and ordered the fleet to proceed to a closer orbit, believing that proximity would do what words could not. And on Earth, Elena watched as the visitors ignored the request and felt the weight of generations settle on her shoulders because she knew what came next had not been used since before humanity learned to leave its cradle openly. And she spoke to a room that held no cameras and said that the warning had failed again, and that restraint was no longer possible. And somewhere deep beneath her, Lunar's surface, a network of machines older than most myths, shifted from passive observation to quiet readiness, systems designed not for conquest but for ending it quickly, while the Concord Council received notice of the Keeler advance and congratulated itself on decisive action, unaware that the ancient slab in their archive had begun to resonate faintly as dormant translation fields activated for the first time in millennia, revealing additional layers of meaning never before decoded. Layers that spoke not of human aggression but of human response, of patience mistaken for weakness and silence mistaken for ignorance. And back on the Keeler flagship, Vial watched as human satellites adjusted their orbits in patterns too smooth to be random, too coordinated to be panic. And he felt the first flicker of unease as his senses picked up energy fluctuations that did not match any known weapon profile. And he asked his science officer for clarification, and was told that the readings suggested massive power redistribution across the system, not localized, not focused, but everywhere at once, as if the star itself were being consulted. And before Vial could issue a new command, the human channel opened again, and Elena's voice came through calm and level as she said, "This is your final notice. Withdraw immediately." And Vial, still convinced that no true threat hid behind such plain words, ordered a warning strike on an unmanned asteroid to demonstrate superiority, and the moment the Keeler weapon fired, the solar wind changed, not violently, not explosively, but deliberately, and every human system that had waited quietly for centuries moved one step closer to activation, because the ancient record had never been a threat. It had been a courtesy, a chance for the galaxy to walk away before learning why no one who truly knew humanity had ever tried to rule it. The warning strike shattered the asteroid into a cloud of glowing debris, and Vial expected panic from the humans, perhaps frantic transmissions or disorganized military movement. But what followed instead was silence so complete that it unsettled even seasoned Keeler officers, because silence in space was natural, but silence in response was not. And as the debris spread along its projected vector, the Keeler sensors began reporting anomalies that made no immediate sense, gravitational ripples that did not originate from any single mass, micro-variations in space-time curvature that suggested controlled manipulation rather than natural fluctuation, and Vial demanded answers as his science officers struggled to reconcile the data with accepted models. While on Earth, Elena stood with her hands clasped behind her back, listening to a countdown spoken quietly by a technician who did not need to raise his voice because everyone in the room understood the gravity of what was being unleashed. A sequence not of weapons, but of permissions cascading through layers of authority designed to prevent exactly this moment from ever arriving without absolute certainty. And as the final authorization was confirmed, Elena exhaled and said, "Initiate Echo Phase 1. And the lunar network responded not with sound or light, but with a subtle shift in the way information flowed through the system. Ancient machines waking fully for the first time since they were sealed away by people who believed their descendants might be wiser than they were. While aboard the Keeler flagship, Vial watched in disbelief as several of his forward scout vessels simply vanished from the tactical display, not destroyed, not disabled, but removed as if they had never been there, and frantic reports followed from nearby ships claiming visual contact with empty space where their allies should have been, and Vial demanded confirmation of enemy fire, but none could be found. No energy discharge, no impact signatures, just absence. And as panic crept into disciplined ranks, the human channel opened once more, and Elena spoke again, saying, "This is what withdrawal looks like. You are being given one last chance to comply." And Vial felt anger flare because the implication that this was restraint rather than attack offended every instinct drilled into him, and he ordered a full fleet scan and aggressive posture, unaware that the scan itself triggered another layer of human response as adaptive systems identified Keeler's sense of frequencies and quietly folded them into a growing library of countermeasures, and across the system human installations that had never been acknowledged by public science adjusted their output, not to target ships directly, but to alter the environment they occupied, turning predictable orbits into shifting uncertainties. While on the Concord Council, world officials received delayed reports of the engagement and dismissed early losses as sensor errors until independent observers confirmed that entire Keeler formations were no longer responding, and an archivist named Saren Val returned to the ancient slab in the Concord archive, driven by a gnawing fear that the warning they had ignored was incomplete. And as she activated deeper translation matrices long considered decorative, she uncovered suppressed annotations describing humanity not as conquerors but as custodians of escalation, a species that learned early the cost of unrestrained power and chose instead to master control. And back on the Keeler bridge, Vial's confidence finally cracked as his navigation officer reported that the fleet's jump drives were failing to align, not malfunctioning but being denied stable reference points, as if the fabric of space refused to cooperate. And Vial demanded a retreat only to discover that retreat required permission now, because the humans had not blocked their path with force but had reshaped the path itself. And Elena watched the fleet struggle and felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness, because every step of this response had been rehearsed in history lessons framed as cautionary tales, and she knew the next phase would end the confrontation decisively but leave scars far beyond this system. And as the Keeler ships drifted in growing disarray, a final message arrived from the Concord Council pleading for clarification and negotiation, and Elena answered them as well, saying, "You were warned long before you met us, and now you are seeing why. That warning was written in stone, because humans do not rush to war, but when pushed they do not miss." And as Phase 2 began silently across the system, the galaxy started to understand that the mistake was not attacking humanity, it was assuming humanity had ever stopped preparing. Phase 2 unfolded without spectacle, because humanity had learned that fear traveled faster through absence than destruction, and as Keeler's ships struggled against navigation systems that no longer agreed with reality, their internal clocks began to desynchronize by fractions of a second that compounded into catastrophic errors, engines firing too early or too late, command signals arriving out of sequence, crews arguing over readings that could not all be true at once, and Vial found himself fighting not an enemy fleet but the erosion of certainty itself. While Elena listened to analysts explain calmly that the temporal shear field was holding steady and that no irreversible damage had yet been done, a reassurance meant for her conscience rather than her strategy, because she knew every additional moment inside the field increased the psychological cost of the intruders, and that cost was a real weapon. And on the Concord Council world, Sarah and Val raced through corridors with copies of the expanded translation, confronting ministers who still clung to the belief that this was an anomaly rather than a revelation, and she read aloud passages describing humanity as a species that survived multiple near extinctions by learning to see war not as victory or defeat, but as systems management, something to be contained, throttled, and ended with minimal loss once escalation became unavoidable. And those words chilled the chamber more than any casualty report, because they implied experience on a scale no living species could claim, and back in Solvile finally ordered all weapons powered down in a gesture of submission that felt like swallowing glass, broadcasting a message of ceasefire and requesting negotiation, and the response from Earth came immediately for the first time. Elena's voice steady as she said that negotiations were always possible before the warning strike, and now only the escalation was on the table, and Vial demanded to know what that meant. And she answered that it meant the fleet would be released in stages once human system confirmed withdrawal trajectories and compliance guarantees, because trust was earned after listening, not before, and as the first Keeler ships were gently nudged back into stable space-time corridors, their crews reported a sensation like pressure releasing from behind the eyes, a collective gasp rippling through the fleet as reality settled back into something recognizable, and Vial watched the data, stabilized, and felt a wave of shame heavier than fear, because he understood now that humanity could have destroyed them without effort, and had chosen instead to demonstrate restraint as dominance. And across the galaxy, independent observers began to piece together fragments of leaked data showing human capability not in raw firepower but in environmental control, predictive modeling, and long-term planning that spanned centuries. And the narrative shifted from surprise to dread as older species remembered half-forgotten encounters with quiet human envoys who asked too many questions and took careful notes, and Sarah and Val addressed the Concord Council again, presenting the final line of the ancient record now fully translated, saying, "If they speak calmly, you are still safe. If they fall silent, you are already late." And on Earth, Elena authorized Phase 2 termination as a last Keeler vessel cleared the inner system, feeling the familiar hollow relief that came with disaster, narrowly avoided. And she wondered how many times humanity would have to prove that peace was their preference and preparation their habit before the galaxy finally learned to listen, while Varel, bound for home under human-monitored corridors, recorded a personal log admitting his failure, and warning any who would follow that humans did not posture because they did not need to, and that provoking them did not awaken a monster, but reminded a caretaker why the locks were built in the first place. And as Saul returned to quiet normalcy, the ancient machines beneath the moon powered down once more, patient as ever, because humanity knew better than anyone that the lesson would spread slowly, but it would spread, carried by fear, respect, and the unshakable memory of a fleet that had entered a system expecting conquest and left grateful simply to be allowed to leave it all. The aftermath rippled outward in ways no human simulation had fully captured, because while the Keeler fleet limped home intact, their reputation did not, and stories of mass and civilization, bending politics and doctrine as surely as gravity bends light, and within cycles border skirmishes paused, expansion plans stalled, and old treaties were reread with fresh unease as species that had never feared consequence began to sense a ceiling above their ambition, while Elena Park sat before the United Earth Assembly answering questions that were less about what humanity had done and more about why it had been able to do it. And she spoke plainly, saying that none of the systems activated were new, that they were the result of long memory and longer fear, born from a species that nearly erased itself before it ever left its home star, and that the real danger was not that humans were powerful, but that others assumed power always announced itself loudly, and on the Keeler homeworld Varel, Turin was stripped of command in a public proceeding meant to restore confidence, yet the chamber was filled with an unease that no ritual condemnation could dispel, because every officer present had read the raw data and understood that their fleet had been handled like a hazardous object rather than an enemy, and that realization hollowed the chest, and Vial accepted his judgment without protest, later retreating into quiet exile where he began compiling everything he could about humanity, not as an opponent but as a phenomenon, documenting patterns of restraint, delayed response, and overwhelming control that suggested a philosophy rather than a doctrine, while on the Concord Council world, Saren Val was elevated from archivist to advisor against her will, tasked with explaining how an entire galactic body had ignored its own history, and she told him the truth that warnings are easy to dismiss when they do not flatter power, and that the oldest civilizations were often the quietest because survival teaches humility faster than conquest, and across human space the public learned only fragments of what had occurred, sanitized summaries that spoke of diplomatic resolution and avoided mention of the deeper system still sleeping beneath moons and oceans, because humanity had learned that transparency had limits when fear could turn inward, and yet among engineers, historians, and retired officers the conversation shifted, old contingency plans reviewed with renewed seriousness, not out of pride but caution, because everyone involved understood that the real failure would be having to use those systems again. And as months passed, a Keeler incident became a reference point in every strategic academy, a case study in what happened when assumption replaced observation, and younger species began requesting human mediators for disputes, believing incorrectly that humans would always intervene, while Elena quietly corrected that narrative in closed channels, saying that humanity intervened only when necessary and preferred others learn restraint on their own, and far beyond known space automated probes returned to dormant human archives, feeding data into predictive engines that map future contact probabilities centuries ahead, because humanity had never stopped looking forward even while it tried to live peacefully in the present. And Vial's private writings circulated in restricted circles warning that humans did not seek dominion, and that was precisely what made them dangerous to those who did, and that any future engagement must begin with listening, not leverage. And as the ancient slab in the Concord archive was finally moved from display to secure containment, its message was updated in every major language, no longer a curiosity but a directive. And yet even then there were whispers among ambitious powers that the humans had revealed their hand and could be counted, because arrogance is resilient. And as Elena stood one evening, watching Earth turn slowly beneath a field of stars she had memorized since childhood, she wondered which would come first, wisdom spreading far enough to make the warning unnecessary, or another fleet convinced that this time would be different, and she suspected she already knew the answer. The next challenge did not come with fleets or threats, but with curiosity sharpened into pressure, as delegations arrived from dozens of systems requesting access to human technology under the language of cooperation while quietly probing for limits, and Elena Park found herself spending more time saying no than negotiating terms, because every request framed as partnership carried an undercurrent of comparison, a desire to measure and rank, and humanity had no interest in reopening that door. While intelligence reports confirmed what the ancient records had predicted, that once fear replaced ignorance it would metastasize into competition, and on the Keeler homeworld Vial Turin watched these developments from exile with a detached clarity, recognizing the familiar pattern of powers who had learned restraint only superficially and now sought shortcuts around it. And he sent private warnings to anyone who would listen that humanity's strength lay not in devices but in patience, a resource most empires burn through quickly, and meanwhile in solar systems beneath the moon remained dormant, but awake in the way a sleeping animal never truly rests, constantly updating models as new data flowed in from diplomatic channels and distant sensors. And Elena attended a closed briefing where analysts explained that several mid-tier powers were attempting to recreate fragments of what they believed humans had used, misinterpreting effects as causes, and she felt a familiar frustration because imitation without understanding had always been more dangerous than ignorance, and she authorized subtle interventions through information channels, nudging false assumptions just enough to prevent catastrophic experiments, because containment was still the goal, and across the Concord Council world Saren Val fought an uphill battle against factions who argued that humanity's restraint was a bluff sustained by secrecy, and she countered by presenting projections showing that even partial success in replicating human methods without the underlying ethical framework would destabilize entire regions of space, and that the warning had never been about fear of humans but fear for everyone else. And as months turned into years, a quiet equilibrium settled in, trade resumed cautiously, borders stabilized, and humanity receded once more into relative obscurity, which suited Elena just fine, because visibility had never been safety, and yet she could not ignore the data, showing long-term probability spikes around future contact points, red markers blooming slowly across star maps like inevitable weather, and she knew that a galaxy was too large and ambition too deeply ingrained for the lesson to hold forever, and Viol's final message reached her through unofficial channels, a simple acknowledgement of understanding and an apology that carried more weight than any formal reparation. And she archived it alongside the ancient warning, adding a human annotation. That restraint was not weakness but choice, and as she signed off on another decade of contingency review, she reflected that humanity's greatest burden was not power but memory, because remembering why the locks were built meant accepting that someday they might have to be tested again, and somewhere beyond charted space a young civilization uncovered fragments of the same ancient record without context or translation, reading only the final line that said, "Do not provoke humans," and they laughed, just as so many others had before deciding to find out why. The laughter did not last long for those who dismissed the warning, because the galaxy has a way of echoing its lessons back through time, and as that distant young civilization began expanding aggressively into neighboring systems, their scouts brushed against human listening posts so old they were mistaken for natural anomalies, and the data flowed inward quietly, tagged, analyzed, and folded into models that had been waiting centuries for new variables, while Elena Park, now older and carrying the accumulated weight of too many near catastrophes, reviewed the projections with a familiar tightness in her jaw, recognizing the same pattern she had seen with Aquila, confidence fed by partial success and ignorance mistaken for destiny, and she convened a council not of politicians but of planners, people who understood that the goal was still prevention, not punishment. And beyond Sol Viol Turin's writings gained wider circulation after his death, no longer dismissed as the guilt of a failed commander, but studied as one of the few first-hand accounts of human restraint in action, and academies began teaching his core conclusion that humanity's power curve was deceptive because it flattened intentionally, hiding peaks behind long plateaus of apparent mediocrity. And yet even with this growing body of knowledge, there were always those who believed themselves exempt from history. And the young civilization pressed forward, seizing trade routes and issuing ultimatums, until their first direct contact with a human convoy escorting refugee ships from a collapsed system, and the interaction was brief and polite, the humans requesting safe passage and the newcomers demanding tribute, and when the convoy declined and rerouted without protest, the incident barely registered as news. But Elena saw the marker flare on her display and felt the old chill, because rerouting was step 1, documentation step 2, and warning step 3, and she authorized a message to be sent not just to the aggressors but to every regional power, a simple factual report outlining human intent and boundaries, and as expected it was ignored by those who believed speed equals strength. And when the aggressors moved to seize one of the refugee worlds under human protection, the response was immediate but measured, shipping lanes subtly destabilized, supply chains interrupted by inexplicable delays, internal communications riddled with synchronization errors that bred mistrust and paranoia, and commanders turned on each other trying to identify sabotage that left no trace, and observers across the region recognized the pattern with dawning horror, because no fleets had moved and no shots had been fired, yet an entire expansion stored as if caught in invisible mud, and Elena watched the situation unfold with grim resolve, instructing her team to maintain pressure without escalation, because the objective was recognition not ruin, and eventually a transmission arrived from the young civilization's leadership, confused and angry but no longer arrogant, demanding to know what had been done to them, and Elena replied with the same calm she had used decades earlier, saying nothing had been done except the enforcement of boundaries they had chosen to cross, and that withdrawal would restore stability. And this time there was no warning strike, no attempt to test the silence. And as their system slowly returned to normal, the lesson spread faster than any archive. Update. Because fear travels quickest when paired with mercy, and across the galaxy a quiet consensus began to form not of admiration but acceptance, that humanity was a fixed feature of the strategic landscape like gravity or entropy, something to be accounted for rather than challenged. And Elena, preparing to step down from her role, recorded her final assessment, noting that the ancient warning had finally begun to work not because it was clearer, but because enough had survived to repeat it. And she hoped that would be enough to spare whoever followed her from having to speak the same calm words to another fleet, convinced that this time the stone had been lying. Years later, the incident with a young civilization was remembered not as a conflict, but as a correction, a subtle shift in the collective behavior of the galaxy that marked the end of an era defined by reckless expansion and the beginning of one shaped by caution. And when Elena Park finally retired, her name faded from public record by design, folded into the same quiet anonymity that humanity preferred for its guardians, while the systems beneath the moon was sealed once more with updated, parameters, and longer prediction horizons, because humanity had learned that peace was not a state but a process that demanded constant maintenance, and across dozens of worlds the ancient warning was no longer treated as myth or curiosity but as inherited wisdom passed from mentor to student, commander to cadet, parent to child, often accompanied by the same simple explanation that humans were not dangerous because they sought dominance but because they refused to allow chaos to spread unchecked. And Vial Turin's writings became required reading in multiple academies, not for their tactical insight but for their humility, a rare trait elevated at last to strategic importance. And as generations passed without major confrontations, some began to question whether the stories had been exaggerated, whether humanity's reputation had grown larger than the truth. And those doubts were tolerated because doubt was natural and curiosity unavoidable, yet whenever ambition edged too close, to provocation, someone would inevitably recall the fleets that vanished without being destroyed, the wars that ended without battles, the system corrected rather than conquered, and the doubt would retreat, and humanity continued its quiet work, trading, exploring, protecting when necessary and withdrawing when possible, never announcing its power because it had nothing to prove. And far in the Concord archive, the original slab of dark crystal remained sealed, its message now fully understood, and finally respected, not as a threat but as a lesson written by those who had learned it the hard way. And the galaxy endured because that lesson spread slowly but steadily, carried not by fear alone but by the shared understanding that some species survived long enough to become warnings to everyone else. And humanity, patient and unassuming, had become exactly that, not the monster others feared but a line no one crossed anymore. Because the oldest truth carved into stone had at last been accepted, that provoking humans was never about inviting war. It was about discovering why they had worked so hard to prevent it.